So I think when people look into what you do, I think the first question that arises from that are like, why do eating disorders form? Like, what is actually going on?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good question. And it's a really complicated question, I think, because one of the things when we think about eating disorders, we always think about food. So we assume that an eating disorder is a problem with food, which naturally it is. There are sort of symptoms that kind of occur around food. But I think if I was to invite somebody to sit here who has an eating problem and explain to you what the difficulty is, food would be one of the last things that they would probably talk about. I think what you would hear is that it's a response to emotional pain. It's often a response to trauma. It often responds to a feeling of being very out of control in your life, of not really feeling like you have a sense of your world that you're living in. For a lot of people, they'll talk about perfectionism, this kind of drive to be the very best that they can be at all times, and how that becomes sort of maladaptive. And I think a lot of it, and for me, and I've been a psychotherapist for sort of 25 years now, I think a lot of it is around identity. I think it's really struggling to know sort of who I am in the world and to make sense of my world. And the eating disorder, it provides this predictability and this sense of control when life feels very overwhelming.
I mean, we were talking just before that, and I was saying that I've got ADHD.
Mhm.
Is there like a form of OCD that comes around eating disorders?
So I think a lot of people with eating disorders can also have OCD. So they're two distinct diagnoses, if you like. But what we can see is quite a lot of quite obsessional, quite compulsive behaviors and thoughts and thinking around the eating problem. So, when we think around food and weight, for example, people can be very fixated on particular numbers. If we're thinking about a restrictive eating disorder like anorexia, for example, then somebody may become very kind of hyper focused on calories or number of steps or particular behaviors and things that they're doing in order to allow themselves, something to eat or whatever that might look like. And I think that very obsessive compulsive thinking is important to sort of acknowledge that that might sit more typically with somebody with a restrictive eating problem. Whereas if you're thinking about a binge eating disorder, or you're thinking about ARFID, or you're thinking about bulimia, like that might look quite different. And when we think about eating disorders, we tend to think about anorexia because that's the one that most people talk about, I guess. Yeah.
What's the difference between what's going on in the brain with binge eating versus someone that could be perhaps anorexic? Because I can imagine there's similar tracks, right?
Mhm. It's really interesting. We're Orri, we run a group program, and we will have people with all different diagnoses, binge eat disorder, bulimia, anorexia, in shared group spaces. And the reason that we do that is because fundamentally, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, eating disorders are about emotional discomfort, emotional pain, emotional dysregulation. And whatever the eating disorder is, that's looking to help solve that problem. And so when we think about what's happening sort of neurochemically, neurobiologically for somebody when they're sort of in that experience, I guess it's a response to how they are feeling, how that eating disorder is presenting in their life, and what it's there to do, like what it's there to serve, if you like. So I think the way that we tend to think about it is much more through that sort of lived experience of having that eating problem. If we get sort of really sort of hung up on the sort of behaviors and the food and the weight, etc., we sort of compound the eating difficulty rather than kind of taking that kind of broader look to say, okay, well, how is this serving you? What is the function of the eating problem that you have? Because it is functional, and I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it has a purpose and it helps. And so if you can understand what the eating problem is doing, then you can work out, okay, how are we going to help that person to recover? Because, we're going to find new ways of managing those difficulties that someone's having.
It's interesting. I had one of the reasons that I was really excited to actually chat to you is there was a lady on the podcast called Kirsty MacLeod.
Mhm.
She's absolutely incredible. I'd urge anyone to listen to her episode. Really, really inspirational. And I'm sure she won't mind me talking about this because she did talk about it on the podcast, but
Mhm.
she had quite extreme anorexia. And what she did is she turned everything around and she almost put the addiction that was anorexia into sport. and now she is, running Ironmans and doing Hyroxes and this incredible, amazing achievements. But
Mm.
she almost discussed it as if she was putting one addiction into another. Like she needed to be obsessive about something, but she didn't want that to be food anymore because she knew what that was doing to her body. Is that like, can you do that in life? Is it possible that if you have anorexia, or let's say you binge eat, or there's an addiction when it comes to food, can you kind of change your mindset to be addicted to something else?
I mean, and I obviously don't want to speak about Kirsty's experience, and so this is my kind of general thoughts around this. But one of the things when somebody presents with an eating problem is, as I said, you're looking at kind of what's the function of that eating problem? What is it there to do? What is it there to help and to manage and to serve? And sometimes people can have multiple, we call them bounces. Okay, so multiple bounces that kind of make up their eating problem. And one of those might be exercise and movement. One of them could be identity related. Sometimes it can be kind of, work. It can be sex. It can be all sorts of different things that people can use as a means of kind of helping them to manage those feelings that they're having. And exercise is a really complicated one because, everybody's encouraged to exercise. It's good for you, endorphins, all of this kind of stuff, right? And I agree with all of that wholeheartedly. One of the questions I often sort of ask people when they first sort of present in treatment and we're thinking about their relationship with movement or exercise is, do you enjoy it? And people go, oh, yeah, no, I love it. I really love it. And I have to do it. And you kind of get into this discussion and you realize that they feel this deep kind of, they're it's like almost like a compulsion, like I have to do it. And I say, oh, talk to me about having to do it. And they will feel that it gives them permission for other things. It gives them that sense of control. It's almost sometimes like a sense of purging, like I get everything out. I clear my head. My body feels, kind of like pushed to the max, whatever it might be. And there's still something that they are getting that therefore allows them to do something else. They're not in this kind of place of balance where, I love running, I love yoga, I'm an ex-dancer, that's my background. So I really enjoy movement. But I have a choice. If it's absolutely lashing with rain outside, I might look at my dog and go, do you really want to go out today? And we
Mm.
might not go. If I've got an eating disorder that's really driving that, I'm going to look at the rain. I might have a stress fracture. I might have a dog that's completely exhausted, but we're going out. We're going to do the 5K or the 10K because that's what's on the, the chart to do today. And it's that relationship that we have to be really thoughtful around.
So it's almost like the compulsion or addiction can go too far.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I suppose the next question that arises from that is, how can you stop that voice in your head that says that is, you're compulsed to do that thing?
Yeah, how indeed. I mean, this is a really complex one. And if, one of your listeners thinks they've cracked it, let me know. I think it takes a long time is the reality. And it takes understanding. It takes thoughtfulness. Like we have to kind of look at what happens. I work very somatically when I work with clients, and the team here work through a very sort of somatic lens, because the body in an eating problem is, well, in everybody's body, right? Your body is an amazing communicator. It's like a series of lots of little signals that are constantly giving you information. And when you're in harmony, sort of mind and body, the two things are kind of unstoppable, right? So if you can really tune into the sensations in your body, if you can hear what it's communicating to you, and we do that consciously and unconsciously, sometimes you meet someone and you just have a really good feeling about them. And sometimes you meet someone and you really don't. And you don't, immediately sort of initially do a sort of big analysis of that. You kind of take that as read. You kind of go, huh. And then latterly, you'll kind of bring your sort of thoughtfulness around that and try to sort of make sense of it. That's your body's emotional kind of signals kind of kicking off. And we do that with everything in our bodies. They're just this extraordinary sort of, well of information. In an eating problem, that gets kind of interrupted. And so we start to override that process. And I think the difficulty then when we start to look at the kind of compulsive parts of the behavior are that it becomes almost behavioral. It's just, this is what I do. It doesn't matter what I feel like. It doesn't matter whether I've got shin splints and I'm going to go and knock out a 10K today. That is what I've got to do. So we start to override that information. So the work of recovery is really helping somebody back into that connectivity. But the connectivity back into the body is a place of terror for somebody with an eating problem. The body has become an unsafe home, which is deeply, deeply sad when you think we all live in our bodies, we inhabit our bodies. You are not you without your body. But so many people I have worked with over the years have said, if I could just leave my body, I'd be okay. And that's
That's really
really,
sad.
yes, deeply, deeply sad. Yeah. I don't want to live in this body. I don't want to be part of this body anymore.
And how do you bring people back from that? Because I mean, that's a really, it's a huge statement.
Mm.
It's almost like you're, for lack of a better term, it's borderline, suicidal ideation because you don't want to be there anymore.
Yeah. You don't want to live in this form. It depends how you bring someone back, I guess. It's understanding why you've had to leave. Why has that body become so unsafe? Is it what you feel in your body? Is it things that have happened to your body that have made the body feel unsafe? Is it that you don't feel you should ever have lived in this particular body? You find yourself in a body that you don't understand or don't recognize. There's so many layers to that complicated relationship with a body. And for those who have never had to kind of question that, it feels illogical. I'm in this body. I just exist in this way. But for so many, and I think for a lot of people, the body ideals that we live alongside, this sort of whole, and it's happening again now. I was kind of growing up in the 90s, and we had this real kind of, you need to be thin to be accepted, and that seemed to sort of evolve away slightly, but we're right back in it with the GLP-1 drugs and all of that stuff around. So we have all these external things that teach us our bodies are wrong, but then we have this deep internal relationship, which I think goes all the way back to your sort of early attachment. Was this a body? Was this a baby that was sort of adored and cherished and, was really held in mind by their sort of early attachment figures? Were you in relationships that were able to tolerate that? And all of these things lay down those very sort of early relationships with our bodies, really.
Yeah, and really early development. I suppose people that kind of fall into these disorders don't really know why a lot of the time it's happening.
No.
But a lot of the time it is because of early, development, and whether you've moved around a lot as a kid and you didn't have stability, and the stability comes from eating.
Yeah.
What is your take on the Ozempic kind of, I don't want to say trend, but that's the word that springs to mind.
Yeah. It's really interesting because as somebody who sits doing what I do, I'm always really interested in, and I'm not doing that annoying therapist thing, like I will answer the question, but I'm quite interested in like how do you see like Ozempic GLP-1s kind of in society? Because I have a very, very, I have a lot of opinions about it, but it's quite interesting just to sort of hear like what you're seeing kind of within your kind of communities, social groups, etc.
That's a great question. I'm very lucky that I've had people on the podcast that are experts in that field. So I've kind of done my research, and from what I've, we had a guy called Naveed Sattar, who is one of the leading experts in weight loss. He's one of the leading experts when it comes to Ozempic. And he himself said, there's going to be a sting in the tail of this. Like, there's no way that you can take that much of a shortcut and it be a good thing. And also what happens is, a lot of people that take Ozempic aren't actually getting to the root issue. So if you start injecting yourself with Ozempic, you're not hungry anymore, so you're not eating. As soon as you come off of it, you're just going to revert straight back to the diet that you had before, and then you're going to put on the weight. There's another lady I spoke to called Jenna Nelson, who's incredible. She's so intelligent, much more intelligent than me. And she was talking about the nutritional value of products today, like vegetables or, onions, fruits, whatever. And she was saying that comparatively to the mid-90s, it's almost like half the nutritional value because the soil is losing nutritional value.
Yeah. So interesting.
And what's happening is, if you think of, you're getting half the nutritional value that people back in the early 90s would get, then you restrict your diet even more, you're not getting nearly enough nutrients. So my take on it is that in life there's no shortcuts. You need to figure out and really look introspectively of what the root of the problem is, and I think that people are avoiding that, and it's really sad. It's really sad to see.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting because I think what you've sort of touched on there is the level of complexity around them, and I think, in our world, what we're seeing is, these medications come along and they're very effective in terms of reducing your appetite, managing hunger signals. We know how they all work on the gut and all of that sort of stuff. So that, we know that they're working. And I'm very, I'm mindful because I am seeing they have positive impacts for some people, right? And so I'm certainly not someone who's saying we shouldn't have GLP-1s and they shouldn't exist. And there's a guy called Johann Hari who wrote the book The Magic Pill. I don't know if you've come across it. And he and I did a talk kind of earlier this year, and we had some really useful, helpful conversations. He went on the medication. It's changed his life. He thinks it's probably given him another 20 plus years of life, et cetera, et cetera. So great. I guess the difficulty that I have is that they've appeared and they are totally unregulated as far as I can see. So, I regularly go online and I buy, Wegovy, Manjaro, because I'm just curious about it. Because I have 15-year-olds who turn up in treatment who are on these pens and they're sharing them around at school. And I'm talking to parents who are saying to me, oh, well, my child's always been a little bit chubby, so I thought it would be good. So they're ordering them off prescription for their 18, 19-year-olds. And, and I'm just seeing this kind of normalization of this. I'm talking to people who say, oh, well, I go onto ChatGPT and I drop in a picture of me and I ask it to make me 3 stone heavier, and then I send that in and then I get the medication. And I'm thinking, oh my word, like the world's gone mad, right? This.
Yeah.
But ironically, if I think I've got an ear infection, I have to wait 2 weeks to get an appointment with my doctor to get some antibiotics. But I can go online, I can spend 180 quid, and within 24 hours on my doorstep, I have these pens sat there. So this is my big fear, because what we're then seeing in our service and lots of services like mine, I was literally in a conversation with somebody about this earlier in the week. We're seeing people with BMIs of 14, 15 who are, in a terrible place because they are now also using GLP-1s. So they are already incredibly, physically compromised, psychologically compromised, and now they have got this medication. And I'm also seeing people with, binge eating disorder or bulimia who have now effectively found the solution to their problem, because when they have felt like previously they haven't been able to sort of manage that sort of appetite sort of regulation. They wanted to restrict and they haven't been able to. They now can. So we're seeing a lot of these very, what I call atypical presentations around anorexia and bulimia, where you've got people, presenting at, still within normal weight ranges, but they've lost 10 kilos in 4 months. Like huge amounts of weight, really, really rapidly, massively out of control. They know that there's a problem. They're fainting. They're feeling dizzy all the time. They're having heart palpitations. They've got pins and needles. They've got all the kind of, problematic kind of medical diagnosis that we're seeing there. And we can't get them into treatment centres because A, some services say we're using GLP-1, so we're not going to treat you. And B, because actually you don't yet meet the criteria, but you're clearly presenting now with something that looks like anorexia, but probably isn't completely. So it's really, really complex what's kind of coming down the track.
Why isn't it regulated? Like, that perplexes me.
I don't understand it. I mean, I really don't understand it. We're trying to sort of put together national guidance at the moment around how we do work with people when they do present, because it's happening. And I think we just have to be conscious of the fact that it's there. So we need to deal. It's a bit like social media, and people say to me, oh, do you think social media should be banned for children? And I go, well, I don't really know that I'm terribly, well placed to have that conversation. But I think we need to have conversations about how they're using it and how we educate them and get real with the fact that it exists. GLPs ones are a little bit like that for me right now. They exist. They're happening. They are so normalized in, I'm in my late 40s, I can sit around tables with people who are like, oh yeah, I've been doing a little bit of Wegovy, just like, wow, like this is where we've got to. And they tell me, and I think, oh, I'm an eating disorder professional. And you think, I'm kind of on board with this. So I don't understand why they haven't been regulated. But I think we've got a lot of problems coming down the track, a lot of problems.
So do I. I think Naveed was talking about some kind of eye disorder that can arise from the use of Ozempic or these kind of drugs. Like there will be, like, nothing in life comes easy. If you want a six pack, you've got to go to the gym, you've got to do 100 sit-ups a night, you've got to do X, you've got to do Y, you've got to curb your diet. Nothing comes easy. And I just think that people naturally take shortcuts because, it's what we do. I think we're all quite inherently lazy. It takes a lot of discipline to not be lazy. And I think a lot of people are just using that as the shortcut. Why, do you see this becoming regulated soon, or do you think that it will take 3, 4, 5 years to get there?
I don't think we've got 3, 4, 5 years. And I think there are people starting to have those conversations. I think we recognize that. I hope it's going to happen sooner than that. And there is a lot of campaigning and there are a lot of conversations going on. I think for me, and I think that's a huge, huge problem. I think the other big problem I've got with this, and I was listening to somebody talking about this recently who said, when you look back over time, like there's been big social change that we have managed. Women got the vote, for example, right? We've managed through kind of like, getting large groups of people to come together to think about like what causes an issue and how to sort of challenge that. And one of the things I feel like GLP-1s have kind of, they've arrived. And for me, the big issue is sort of weight stigma, right? Like the GLP-1s treat bodies, but they don't treat bias. And this is my sort of struggle with them. And I guess weight stigma for me has this sort of real sort of social prejudice. And yes, GLP-1s can change your body so it better fits societal norms, and maybe that makes the body more healthy and, etc. And that's where I say I'm not, completely kind of like one camp or another with this. I appreciate that there's a lot of complexity. And Johan would sit here and say, I genuinely think they've saved my life, which, great. The bigger thing for me is like this stigma, this is, I don't know, the way it's justified, if you like, is this sort of concern for health. It's about encouragement. It's about people being better, and I think, well, actually, I think they just legitimize this shaming, and we've introduced this kind of clinical tool that sort of says, if you live in a thinner body, you're going to be much happier, but we don't think about the food environments that people are growing up in, or the poverty, or the trauma, or the racism, or the ableism, or all these other things that are happening. And I fear that we further marginalize people who can't actually access these medications. There's a lot of people for whom 180 quid a month is way outside of their, remit, for most people, really. And secondly, might not be able to. They might have other physical complications that mean that they can't. And some people are genetically predisposed. What's the word? Disposed. Thank you. To live in a bigger body, right? So I'm kind of like, what are we doing here? And I think this kind of level of, body surveillance that we're living in, and we've always lived in it. It could be undone. There are ways that we could address this. There are conversations that we could be having. We could start to educate our children differently and help them understand their bodies in a different way. But we're missing this amazing opportunity to do that. And we stick sugar taxes on and calories on menus, and then we say, oh, everyone can just take GLP-1s, and then we'll all be sorted. And lo and behold, we're not. What we'll see is just, much bigger stigma gaps around wealth and compliance. We'll see people in larger bodies being blamed for not using things that, they perhaps should be. And I just think the problem will continue, which I think is really sad.
Chisholm Hunter are the sponsors of the Into the Mind podcast, and without Chisholm Hunter, we would not be sitting here today. Honestly, if you like luxury watches or luxury diamonds, Chisholm Hunter is the place to go. Amongst the luxury watch industry at the moment, there's tons of fakes kicking around, which is a really dangerous place to be. You do not want to buy a fake watch and get conned into buying a fake watch. And that's why people normally go to authorized retailers. Now, Chisholm Hunter is an authorized retailer, and they're authorized retailers for Omega, Tudor, Vacheron Constantin, Blancpain, Breguet. The list goes on and on and on. So if you want to buy a watch safe and securely, then head to chisholmhunter.co.uk. To top that off, they're also family run, and they've been going for over 165 years, which is pretty awesome. So head to chisholmhunter.co.uk for a luxury watch or your next luxury diamond. And while you're there, use the discount code CHSUB, that is CHSUB, for an exclusive discount on selected lines. That is chisholmhunter.co.uk, that is chisholmhunter.co.uk. And on that note, let's get back to the podcast. A lot of the time in life, and I've been openly criticized on the podcast before for this, but when you start following the money, normally things become quite clear. Like normally things that you thought were, oh, well, this is happening accidentally or it's just a trend. No, it's because there's a lot of money behind it. You look at what happened during COVID, and there was huge amounts of money being thrown around in government grants and taxes. And all of a sudden there was more people becoming rich during COVID than there has been ever. And you're thinking, well, right, something's going on here. And I think the same is happening with Ozempic. And I can't remember the guest that I had this conversation with, but it was super interesting. We looked into the average retention time on a mobile phone. So if you go on your phone and you're on, like, let's say Instagram or whatever, it would count as average retention. So the average retention in America, which I'm guessing would be similar in the UK, is about 7 hours a day.
Wow.
Right? Firstly, that's so odd because that's a huge number. But secondly, if you think of how long you're on social media, so let's say you're on social media for 3 hours of that 7, you are being targeted by ads based on your insecurities. Now, this is a huge thing when it comes to Botox, fillers for guys, hair transplants, all this kind of stuff. So if you're being shown ads every day for years, for 3 hours a day, eventually that's going to stick. And I think, and I don't know this for a fact, but I don't believe there's any restrictions in advertising Ozempic.
It depends how it's marketed, I suspect, actually. So if it's as a medical aid, then possibly not. I mean, ironically, there are lots of restrictions for us if we want to talk about eating disorders and treatment. So, we'll run into lots of issues with sort of meta and, if we want to kind of put sort of information out to sort of say we exist and this is what we're doing. But interestingly to that point, so I have a very bizarre, as you probably do, quite bizarre feeds on my social media because I look at all sorts of things and I often think, if someone looks at this, they're going to be like, geez, this woman's got issues. But, I get constant information, a woman in my late 40s, constantly being bombarded with weight loss, gummies for menopause, and consistently now, you can buy your weight loss medication from us, quick and easy, here's a discount, etc. One of the things that's been really, really alarming is that I have been buying this medication and I now get constant emails offering me discounts to keep purchasing the medication. And with one particular supplier, I go back on every 4 to 8 weeks. And I've actually done a couple of things with a couple of journalists around this, which is why I'm really quite passionate about this. And I will go on and I will put exactly the same information back in again. So it's fraud, but I've falsified my weight and my condition, etc. And I put exactly the same information every time. And I've been doing this now for probably nearly a year. And they just send me the medication again. So nothing's changed. Nobody said, this is the 8th time you've ordered this medication. And, it's exactly, and I think this is to your point of following the money. Nobody's sitting there worrying about this. Now, my concern is when I have these 16, 17, actually the youngest I've had is 15-year-olds coming into treatment, buying this medication online, taking it into school or college. I've spoken to boarding house mistresses who say to me they find the little, I don't know if you've ever seen a Ozempic pen, but they have these little needles that screw on the top. They're finding them, in common rooms, in schools or in dorm rooms, in, boarding schools. The kids are sharing the needles. They're working out how to dismantle the pens. They're taking out the liquid. They're buying the individual components. They're mixing it up themselves because it's cheaper. Suddenly you go, oh dear. Like this is, like the kind of whole oxy crisis that hit the US. Like I kind of see it a little bit on that scale, because we have no idea how many people are using it currently. That's what's worrying me.
And it's been privatized. I think that's worse, because
Absolutely.
there's a clear motive, and you have people. The business that I'm in jewelry, it's very like emotionally driven,
Mm.
and it's not immoral. Like everyone needs to make a profit, but when you get
Yeah.
to preying on people's insecurities,
Yeah.
that's immoral.
Yeah.
And there's companies at the moment, startups that were made maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that are now worth millions. And they've grown that fast because they're preying on the insecurity of people that are overweight.
Yeah.
And I just don't know. I really do think, and I'm not sure what the kind of legislation is around advertising and what the government's putting into place, but they always seem to be like 10 years behind what's happening. And as a
Yes.
result, you get these issues that they can't catch fast, and people do get addicted to. I mean, vapes. They said that they would ban disposable vapes. So what the disposable vape company did is they put a little charging port in the back, even though they know it's still a disposable vape, and they're
Oh.
still available. So they said they banned vapes, they didn't. And as a result, you have these school children that are 12, 13, 14 years old digesting and consuming something that is created in a lab in China that nobody knows what it actually does.
Yeah. Yeah. It Yeah. And the difficulty is, I think, going back to the fact that they are, whether it's a vape, which gives you some kind of hit or something, I don't know, but with GLP-1s, they work. They are
Mm.
really, really effective. So on the one hand, they are a very effective medication. We haven't got huge amounts of sort of longitudinal data against them yet, but they are making they do exactly what they say on the tin. And I'm watching this happen. And, I do worry a lot about the kind of psychological impact of this more broadly on society and what this is saying. But I also worry about the factually, like, what is happening to your hormones, the level of disruption, what's happening to your heart, your digestion, your bone density, your immune system. I'm seeing
Mm.
people who have got terrible fatigue, they're dizzy, they're sort of one person I spoke to said, oh, 1 minute I'm hot, 1 minute I'm really cold. I don't really know what's going on. I've lost a bit of hair. My skin's gone a bit weird. Are you going to stop taking it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So it's
Okay.
becoming an addiction, really.
I think it is, yeah. And it's a really interesting world for us because it sits between the world of addiction and eating disorder. And we're having to really kind of go, right, we need to get educated. We need to be thinking very differently about this. But in the same way that somebody with an eating disorder who's purging, for example, who's making themselves sick or using laxatives, it feels like it's a very sort of similar process that's happening. But we're educating people into how to do that. I mean, we've been teaching people how to lose weight forever. You look at,
Mm.
again, I don't want to sort of speak ill of these organizations because I know they've helped people, but the Slimming Worlds and the, Weight Watchers, you read their how to. I mean, it's kind of like how to be anorexic kind of guide, and a bit of shaming with the public standing on a scales and everyone going, oh, you didn't lose very much this week. And, oh, you did lose weight, you get a star. It's we've been doing it for a long time, but I am really concerned about where this goes, actually, because we are seeing people coming in with, perhaps have lived in larger bodies, now living in more normative bodies, whatever that means, who have got malnutrition. They can't make decisions because their decision making has gone offline. They're really emotionally dysregulated and they're sort of feeling tremendously at a loss, and they're quite depressed and they're quite suicidal because we just took away food, which was what they were using to manage their lives with.
Where do you see this going? I mean, like, let's say there's no regulation that gets brought into place, and we're 5 years down the line, and we're having another podcast. Where do you see it going?
Well, I think we'll have a lot of thin people around. Genuinely, I think we will see bodies continuing to shrink. I think we will see huge numbers in increases in the demand for mental health services, because we are not addressing the fundamental reason for not everybody, but for a number of people who live in larger bodies and are dissatisfied by that. There's a reason why that is happening, why that relationship with food exists in that particular way. And if you take that away, what are you going to do instead? You know,
Mm.
it's like you were talking about earlier. You know, you stop the restricting and you do a Ironman or a High Rocks. You know, well that's great, but a lot of people are not going to do that. So where are they going to go instead? You know, are they going to be vaping or using other types of drugs? You know, are they going to start self-medicating or that you're not dealing? Nobody's dealing, and that's where I think we've got a big problem, really. Yeah, and I don't know where it goes.
What is the first step that someone can take? I mean, like, if I was to identify that I had some kind of eating disorder, whether it be, eating too much or too little, what is the first step that I can take to try and, someone that might be listening to this might have the inkling that something could be wrong. What is the first step that they could take to being, and I don't want to say more healthy, but being more ease with what's actually happening inside of them?
I mean, if somebody actually starts to have that realization for themselves, it's a really positive place to be. The difficulty with eating disorders is often that doesn't happen because you've found the solution to your problem. So it's often
Mm.
somebody else looking on who says, I'm worried about you, or is starting to think, oh, this doesn't look okay. When people finally are able to talk about the fact that something isn't quite right, they usually have known for a long time, which is interesting. They've felt something's off, and I encourage people at that point. Some people like to write, some people like to draw, some people like to talk, but to find a space where you can communicate like what's going on, and we can kind of, we can connect to it's, like you say, oh, I'm not eating enough, or I'm eating too much, or my body's changed and I'm feeling something about that. In my experience, people who are losing weight very rarely see that as a problem. People who
Yeah.
are, they feel their bodies are getting bigger, they're gaining weight, they see that as a problem. So they're more likely to reach out and say, this isn't okay. Because, of course, if you're losing weight, you'll get everybody telling you, oh, you look great, and what are you up to? And so you get a lot of positive reinforcement. Um, I think it's about having it's internal sort of dialogue. And again, I go back to, I think we really do need to help to educate people more broadly to kind of understand what good feels like for them, because it's so personal. How me feeling good and balanced will be different to how you feel good and balanced in your body. That's just because we're two different people, different genders, all of that stuff. But I think the first thing I always say to people is, if you've got that little niggle of a worry, there are places you can reach out to. You can reach out to people like Beat, or an eating disorder charity, or you can reach out to people like us. But you might not see that as the problem yet. Usually the problem is, I'm in a relationship that I'm not happy in, or I've got discomfort at work, or I'm worried about exams, or I've fallen out with a friend, or I'm struggling with something that's happening to me and I don't know how to make sense of it. I'm frightened, I'm fearful. It's usually that you start to talk about first. And through that experience, you kind of maybe start to recognize that there's this other issue occurring. It's
Yeah,
complex, I
and
think.
people kind of dig a little deeper, I'm guessing, when let's say I fell out with a friend. Well, why is that causing me this anxiety and causing me to restrict things? And or well, maybe I have a issue around, I need to have people around all the time, or I don't feel good. So is that, yeah? So you'd say kind of identify the surface level and then start trying to dig below it.
Yeah, and sometimes, so for example, if you take that as as a something that might happen, you might fall out with somebody, or someone might say, my I don't seem to be getting on with my friends very well, and you'll say, oh, okay, what's happening? And it's like, well, actually, I'm finding it really difficult to spend time with them. Oh, talk a little bit more about that. Well, and often then, if you've got a restrictive eating disorder, it would be, well, everyone was going to the cinema, but then they were going to go and grab a Nando's afterwards. And I didn't really feel like I could do that because obviously I'm starting to feel anxious about being out with people and eating. Or when I go out with my
Mm.
friends, they started to notice that I'm not eating or drinking as much. They might make a comment about it. Or people have started to say to me, I'm a little bit worried about you. Or if I go out with you tonight, that means I can't go back and do my run. Or so they're starting to make choices that are switching them from being connected to being disconnected. Every eating disorder sort of thrives in secrecy. It thrives in silence. So the eating disorder will always invite somebody away from people. It will invite that disconnection. And that's why people can become quite aggressive sometimes, or quite irritable, or quite hard to reach. They can seem perhaps previously kind of easygoing and quite friendly, and now they're just quite hard to kind of get hold of. And I think that's what people start to feel, is like, my life is changing slightly, and that can be quite difficult.
It thrives in secrecy. That's a
Mm,
scary thing to hear.
mm. Yeah, it does. And I think if you think about the sorts of things perhaps that start to lead to somebody needing to do that withdrawal from people, and to sort of really rely on the self, like to kind of really dig inwards rather than connect outwards. Often it's things that are happening in your life that are quite difficult. You might feel ashamed of them. I was bullied as a teenager, and I felt such shame about being bullied. I felt like it was me, like I was the problem. And so when difficult things like that happen in your life, it's really hard to say even to your friends, like, this is hideous, I hate it, I feel embarrassed, I'm ashamed. So I can see how if difficult things are happening, to actually acknowledge that, to step into that vulnerability, it's incredibly intimate. If things are happening to you that are scaring you or frightening you, if you're having a difficult situation at work, if you're worried you're going to lose your job, if your marriage is failing, your relationship's not going as you hope, these are really hard things to sit down and say to people, like, this is really tough, I'm finding it really hard.
Is there something happening kind of neurochemically in the brain, specifically around anorexia, when they do, because essentially what's happening is you're starving your body, right? Is there something that happens in the brain that makes you feel good? Or is it that when you do eat, because your body's not used to it, you just feel really bad?
Well, it's really interesting, because when you go into restriction, for example, your brain enters a sort of threat mode, essentially. So it puts you on high alert. And so your anxiety actually increases initially, because your brain is kind of going, need to eat, need to eat, need to eat. It's mission control, it needs to be fed. And it's a hungry organ, it takes a lot of calories out of your body. So often what you see is people becoming more anxious and more rigid initially, and becoming more preoccupied. You get what's called sort of reduced prefrontal cortex activity. So your decision making, your flexibility literally goes offline. And when you have increased anxiety and stress, the prefrontal cortex floods with cortisol, which the whole thing becomes like, very ineffective in terms of how it operates. So the sort of obsession then with food becomes a survival response.
Right.
We need to eat to live, but that sort of survival response almost kind of becomes quite distorted. So in an anorexic brain, what happens is, rather than, if I'm hungry, my brain will start to signal to me around lunchtime, look, it's time to have something to eat, and then I'll start to think about creating some space to go and eat. When that signal comes into an anorexic's brain, then what they start to think is, it's a threat, right? So it's time to eat. So I now need to start to engage in the behaviors that help me to minimize that need to eat. So then the behavioral patterns start to shift. I might take myself for a walk. I might start to drink water. I might eat chewing gum. I might look at other ways to fill. I might absorb myself in a piece of work. I'll do whatever I can to disconnect from that feeling of hunger. I will avoid the feeling of hunger. And that's the sort of difficulty then, when you're starting to sort of look at the behavioral shifts that need to happen. Because, as you say, when I then eat something, I go into a whole different set of terror, which is I can then feel that food inside of my body. And I might use different behaviors. So I might eat slowly. I might cut my food up into tiny pieces. I might hide food. I might eat certain things that will overfill me, so I can feel much fuller than I actually am. All of these things to
Mm.
try to manage sort of and minimize the sort of impact of that eating. And then as a result of that, I might take a really long time to eat, for example, and then I can convince myself, right, I've had enough, I've done enough, and then I can move on. So you're trying to kind of trick the
Interesting.
brain. Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, so that exactly what I was about to say. So it's just about ways of tricking your brain to almost think you've done it, but you haven't.
Yeah. 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 And constantly preoccupy yourself, constantly busy. So, people with anorexia are yeah, one of the reasons I really love working with people with eating disorders generally is they're very creative, they're very bright, they're very often very intellectual people, very driven people. So you find really kind of ingenious ways that somebody is kind of managing their life in order to, avoid food, which feels again quite counterintuitive when you don't have that eating problem.
And what about the flip? I'm guessing that the flip side of someone binge eating is just that, we've all had a takeaway on a Sunday night when we're hungover. You feel better in the moment, but then worse in the long run. Is it just that that's essentially what's happening? It's endorphins.
Yeah, I mean, you get a dopamine spike when you have a binge. And again, there's a lot of behavior that goes around that binge. So people might plan that binge. They might feel excited about that binge. They might, allow themselves to eat bad foods or the things that they think they shouldn't be having. So they'll get kind of quite into that. They might go to certain places. They might eat in secret, which can feel quite exhilarating. They might take themselves away from people because it can be very shameful when they're eating sort of huge amounts of food. So it has this whole kind of routine and ritual around it, which then they follow, they get the big dopamine, and then, that crashes. And then what happens is they go into the shame cycle, which is really, really difficult. And the way that they manage the shame is usually to kind of seek the dopamine to pull them back up. So they go and they binge again. So they get this sort of temporary emotional relief followed by this really intense distress.
And how would you suggest, if someone's listening to this that maybe has that disorder, they're binge eating, they're maybe obese or overweight, what would be the first steps to break that cycle?
Well, just out of interest, not everybody with a binge eating disorder is obese or overweight, which is something that we can sometimes fall into a trap of thinking. So you might recognize that you're somebody who does have these sort of cycles of binging. And we don't just binge food, right? We binge Netflix. We're encouraged to, like it's a cool thing to do, right? So we binge lots of things. But when somebody's binging food, one of the things that we invite is, and it's always about pace, is about slowing that down. So kind of bringing it into awareness, exactly in the same way if you're restricting food, sort of just bringing into awareness kind of what is actually happening. So, we deal a lot with reality, like the reality of what is happening. So if you're binging, actually sort of taking a moment just to reflect and think, okay, what have I eaten? Because one of the things people who are binging will often talk about is almost kind of having an out of body experience. Like they're kind of quite dissociated during
Mm.
that process. And they don't really want to look at what they've eaten because it's can be quite shaming. They can feel quite embarrassed, they can feel quite horrified, they can feel really frightened. And obviously that kicks off the shame and that kicks off the distress. And then lo and behold, they're binging again. So they're in that sort of cycle. So I think it's really important to sort of slow it down, to sort of acknowledge what's happening. The process of kind of reconnecting into the body. So sometimes people will binge to the point where they are physically sick, not through induced vomiting like in binge in bulimia, but just through the physicality of having had so much food in their body. And being curious about kind of what you're seeking in that process. What is it that you need? People will talk about just wanting to shut everything down, tune everything out. To not feel is often what people are seeking. I just don't want to feel anything. I don't want to think about anything. I often think about, I don't know if you've ever had a small baby and fed a small baby, but you used to sort of say that babies are like milk drunk when they've had a
Mm.
feed, and they sort of lie there and they just look sort of incredibly contented and their eyes sort of flutter and their cheeks are sort of squidgy. And it's almost that feeling that people describe sort of seeking when they're in that binging state. I just want to be blissed out. But the binge eating disorder is a lie because you will never get there. In the same way that anorexia is a lie, and it will keep lying to you because it will say, well, if you can just weigh 50 kilos, if you can just weigh 40 kilos, if you can just weigh 30 kilos, there's always this other place that you're trying to get to
Mm.
that will feel better. And it's
E-
tomorrow never comes.
Exactly. Is there a link between neurodivergence and eating disorders?
There's definitely a very high number of people who present in services for eating disorder treatment who also have, it might be people with autism, they might have avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So whether there's a genetic link, we don't know, but we do know that if you like, they're overrepresented in our population. I think there's lots of thinking around why, you know, the rigidity, the safety, the kind of control, the order in sort of more restrictive illnesses. The very sort of behavioural, functional aspects of an eating disorder can be very reassuring. And also, I think looking at, you know, what often people will talk to me about is they will say, but it's good to have a thin body. It's good to have a healthy body. If I'm thin, it means that I'm successful. It means that I'm more popular.
Mm.
People like me more. Like, it's very literal, and you go, yep, I get it. It's really hard to argue sometimes. Like, it's really very, you know, yeah, that's the reality. It can be quite hard to treat because, you know, you're having to sort of really help somebody sort of integrate a different way of understanding that and thinking about that. And often we don't recognize the complexities for somebody with a person with autism, for example, who has an eating disorder. We try to just treat them exactly the same, and we might not understand their sensory needs and the sort of broader issues that need to be thought about. But yeah, it's interesting. We do see an increasing number of people. Yeah.
It's interesting. The reason I ask is that I said at the start, so I'm riddled. I'm literally patient zero when it comes to ADHD, and it drives everyone a bit crazy. But I definitely find myself, along with other people that have that neurodivergence, dopamine hitting on certain things.
Yeah.
So that brings you back up to the baseline where maybe a normal person would sit. So as I understand it, people with ADHD kind of idle just below the baseline, and as a result, what they do is they try and constantly put it back up. And as a result, you get a lot of ADHD people that might smoke or might drink too much, or they have ways of trying to boost that serotonin and, you know, make themselves feel better. And I just wonder if there's a correlation between that and food, because for me, there was definitely, when I was younger, a correlation between that and alcohol.
Yeah,
I knew
yeah,
that
yeah.
if I drank,
Yeah.
I'd feel better, so I
Yeah.
drank a lot. And you know, a lot of people get that with smoking, whatever it might be. But I just
Yeah.
wonder if there's a correlation between that and food.
There is. I think it's an interesting one. I think there is also for sure there is a correlation between that and food, and particularly with the sort of dopamine seeking sort of behaviors in binge eating disorders. Actually, the kind of highs that somebody might get with something like anorexia, and often the use of exercise, for example. We can get a lot of clients with ADHD who also present with sort of very high levels of exercise in their lives and can become very preoccupied, but often feel that they can't sustain it and those sorts of things. But actually, one of the things I'm really interested in, and we have a really active alumni at Orri, and a lot of clients sort of talk quite openly about this, is where we see people with autism, people with ADHD, what they actually talk about is the bullying that they've experienced, or the feeling like they've been misunderstood in their lives, or they've been punished for, you know, not being able to sit still, or not, you know, being too much, or whatever it might be. And so actually they talk about this kind of chronic invalidation almost. And that's something that seems to become quite quite important for us to hear and for us to listen to, in terms of looking at, okay, how does the eating disorder then develop in terms of protecting or controlling? And that's something when, you know, I think about what then sustains that eating problem for someone. You know, we can say, well, you know, you've got ADHD, so, you know, like sitting in a group for 50 minutes or an hour can feel really sort of overwhelming. It's really difficult. And then we bring people into services. We don't meet, you know, that person's needs because, well, our groups run for an hour and that's just how we do it. And I think, well, we're missing the opportunity to support this person. How about with that person, we walk and talk? You know, clearly, if you've got a BMI of 13, I'm going to have to think about how long we walk for. But, you know, there might be other ways to actually start to engage this person. Maybe we do it through music. Maybe we do it through art. Maybe we do it through having, you know, shorter bite-sized, pardon the pun, sessions. You know, we sort of think about different ways of sort of engaging somebody. And that's how I think we then start to address it. And then we can look at kind of what are the sensory discomforts, or what is feeling out of control in your body, or, you know, what did happen in your bodily changes that made it really difficult for you to be able to regulate that feeling of I need to keep moving, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
What are your take on like modern beauty standards and also filters and editing when it comes to social media photos?
I'm not a big fan. Probably won't surprise you to hear. I mean, for me, it's this constant sort of moral or moralization, if you like, of the idea that your body is good or it's bad or it's disciplined or it's lazy, you know, it's fat or it's thin. Like this, the way that my body looks in the world tells you something about me, and it tells you something about my values, and you will therefore make your sort of assumptions around me as a result of what you see or you don't see. So I really struggle with you know, I don't think culture causes eating disorders, for example. I don't think it's as simple as that, but I certainly think it can very strongly sort of reinforce them. And I think, as we said earlier, you know, this idea that, you know, being thin, because that's what everybody wants to be, is this symbol of worth. It gives me value and it gives me impact in society. You know, I am more pure, I am more successful if I look a certain way. Now, I'm naturally blonde, I'm 5'2". So I kind of come into the world with a certain set of privileges, if you like, that not everybody has, because people make assumptions. They think I'm sweet and I'm kind and I'm nice, and I can be those things, but I can also be a pain in the ass. I can be loud. I can be, you know, irritated and irritable and all of those things as well. So, you know, I'm really interested in kind of like what happens in the world in terms of how we see and understand people. And you know, I can go on social media and I can go through my feed. And I mean, it doesn't typically bother me, but, you know, I can see how it would, because I can look at other people and I think, wow, they're living the most extraordinary life. Like, they're always on holiday. They're always out at dinner. They're always, I don't know, walking on a beach on a windswept day, looking absolutely sensational. And I've got my hair pulled back and my makeup's running down my face and my dog's really badly behaved and, you know, all of this sort of stuff. So I can feel very quickly a bit rubbish. And And I just don't think we talk enough about the normalization of that. I've got somebody close to me in my life she's younger than me, and she's been on a dating app recently. So she comes and she says to me, "Oh my God, you know, I've met this person and he's told me X, Y, Z about himself." And I turn up and fine, he's 2 inches shorter and I don't know, he works in finance, whatever that means, you know, but actually,
Yeah.
I don't know, he's a cashier and whatever. All great, all fine. But she said the weirdest thing is they don't look like they do in their pictures.
No.
And I find this a really fascinating phenomena that's almost becoming acceptable to have like a social media presence. This is what I look like online, but it's okay that I look totally different when I meet you in person. Because surely if you're on a dating app, the idea is you're going to meet in person. So I find this a really, really curious phenomena that's starting to occur.
It's actually really interesting you bring that up. So I quite recently actually broke up with my girlfriend.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I listen. It kind of is what it is. She was amazing, but it just kind of came to its natural end. But
Yeah.
I'm now back on those kind of dating apps.
Yeah.
And as a photographer and videographer, like that was my profession. I can see it like instantly. Like, people think they're covering this stuff up and making a good job of edits. I can tell you for a fact they're not.
Yeah.
And I actually had a conversation. I won't say who because he'll absolutely assassinate me. But there was a conversation I was having with someone, and he showed me this girl, and he was, "Oh, she's great. She's gonna be my new wife. I'm so in love." And I said, "You do realize the bricks, which are square behind her, they're all curved." So essentially what's happened there is she's pushed everything in and it's brought the bricks in behind her
Yep.
as well. And he went, no, that can't be right. I was like, no, I promise you, you're going to meet this person and they might be lovely, but I guarantee you they're not going to be what what was on the pack.
Yep.
And then it brings up another issue of having too much choice. Like, when you go to a restaurant and you have tons and tons of options at a restaurant, you often can't pick, and oftentimes you can't make a decision. And I think in relationships, that's kind of what's happening now. You're on social media, you're on Instagram, you're on, you know, Tinder or Hinge, whatever it might be. And there's so many options that you end up picking nobody. And that can then lead, and also it's set up to be addictive. It's really interesting because I do this, I kind of look quite deeply at things now. And the way that Hinge works, which is the dating profile that everyone uses nowadays, it'll give you 10 free likes And on the 11th like, it will show you a guy or a girl that is gorgeous, that is beautiful. And you try and like them, and it goes, give me £100 or you can't like that person. And you think, oh my God, that's going to be my husband or my wife. What do I do?
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's almost set up to be addictive.
Yeah.
So they don't want you to leave the app. Because if you get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, then you're not paying them anymore.
Yeah.
So it's really, really interesting, going back to the Ozempic stuff. When you follow the money, you can normally figure out the motive.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find fascinating about this, and this idea that we're having to portray this version of ourselves in order to be valuable, in order to be purchased. So like you say, there's this algorithm that's pumping out this information, that's reinforcing this idea around comparison. It's reinforcing this idea around, this what I call body surveillance, right? Constantly having to sort of analyze and examine the body, to be constantly thinking about what this body looks like, because what that body looks like will say, yes, I have worth, yes, I have control, yes, I'm successful, yes, I'm whatever, right? And the apps, I think, are a classic example of that, as is Instagram, as is TikTok, etc. But I find this, it's really difficult, right? Because in the mid-90s, when I was running around being, late teens, in my 20s, you'd go to a bar or a pub or a gig, or that's where I went, or to a club, and you'd meet someone and you'd talk to them and you'd have this whole experience with them. And you might pick people that I don't know, if I look back at the boyfriends I had growing up, they're all quite different. Some were short, some were tall, some were more built, some were more skinny. It was very much about like the human being that I met and connected with. And that's how I formed my relationships. Same with my friendship group. It's really quite eclectic. And look now at people's kind of, I've got sort of kids, sort of late 20s and early 20s. And I talk to them and I say, well, what about just like, going to a bar? And they go, oh, you can't talk to someone in a bar. I said, what do you mean you can't talk to someone in a bar? Well, you don't do that anymore. You don't do any of that anymore, Mum. That's like really weird.
Yeah.
What's weird about it? Oh, no, you don't do that. That's really odd. My son has recently met someone. He's an absolutely little smitten kitten at the moment. He's head over heels for this young woman. And if they listen to this, she knows already, so it's fine. But he met her in a club. At the end of the night, the lights were coming up. He'd spotted her across the dance floor and he was like, wow, you're the most amazing person I've ever seen. Clearly at this point, it's still on sort of physical attraction. Fine, we have to have physical attraction in an intimate romantic relationship. But then they connect and they have this big conversation and they walk the streets for the whole night and, da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. And they fall for each other. And I think, wow, that is so lovely, but apparently very rare. Because we're not being...
Extraordinarily rare.
And we're not being taught how to do it. We're being taught how to go onto these apps. So, I saw a 4-month-old baby who, the mother picked up a phone, and as the phone went by, they were a little bit sort of distressed. And as the phone went by, the baby calmed and tried to look at the screen. 4 months old.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
I have a 10-year-old nephew who, by the age of 1, was fully navigating, an iPad. I'm not fully navigating an iPad. I mean, I'm impressed with it.
Neither am I.
I mean, I was like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. There is it's interesting as well because the social media is almost thriving on, specifically men get targeted for this, but men's failed attempts at approaching a woman.
Okay.
So I often see this, like in the gym, there'll be a guy that goes up to a girl and says, can I help you put your weights away? And the girl is filming her doing weights and then puts it up on social media. Look at this creep trying to talk to me in the gym. And as a result, what you get is all these men that are probably good guys, most of them, that think, oh, I can't talk to a girl in person anymore. Because if I talk to a girl in person, that might go on social media and that's a risk. And it's this really weird kind of surface level. It's a bit like Dubai. Listen, it's great. It is great, but it's very surface level. Yeah. Like you have an incredible Italian restaurant in Dubai with no Italian heritage. Like you have these incredible places, but it's very surface level. It's very much, look at me, I'm here. And the world is turning into that. When I first went on the dating apps recently, what height preference do you want? What age preference do you want? What color of hair do you want them to have? And I was like, this is insane. Like this level of detail is absolutely crazy. Absolutely. And people have this idea of what they want. Typically, it's actually the opposite. I actually remember my mum and dad telling me you need to find someone that is kind of the yin to your yang, someone that's very different with you that you can grow with instead of growing apart from. And if you find someone too similar to you, you're probably going to grow apart because you don't complement each other in
Yeah, yeah.
certain ways. Yeah, and I just feel like society nowadays, it's just mental how over sexualized and kind of surface level it is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you think about that from a relational perspective, you think about, we are fundamentally creatures that are biologically wired to connect to another human. So the first neurons that fire when you're born are your mirror neurons, and you're seeking the gaze of your attachment figure for safety. So that's how
Wow.
fundamental it is. Yeah, it's extraordinary. If you watch, so my sort of background is in attachment, and you watch newborn babies being laid on a mother, and obviously they wiggle, they move up, but they move with gaze. And so yes, there's smell and they're seeking milk and they're seeking that connection, but they're also seeking the gaze. And so babies who can be very well fed, who can be very well cared for, who are perhaps being looked after by a parent with postnatal depression, for example, who is really struggling relationally to connect with that baby because of the difficulties that they're having, those babies often won't thrive as well. And they might not thrive as well as babies who perhaps aren't being fed enough or nurtured, but they're getting all of that kind of emotional connection in other ways. It's really fascinating to look at this. So when you then sort of fast forward that and you take that into sort of adult relationships, and and I think this is super relevant for the work that I do, because as I said earlier, I think it's all about identity, and it's all about relationship. The big thing that you have to do in each sort of treatment is build a relationship with somebody. Without that, you've got nothing, right? So I think about, well, what's gone wrong in people's lives, and not just people with eating problems, actually, sort of generally, is we really struggle to trust ourselves in relationship with another, in that intimate kind of delicate, fragile space of being with and being alongside. And so, if you can't be in those kind of really intimate, vulnerable places, you'll find it hard to challenge someone. You'll find it hard to navigate conflict with someone. You'll find it hard actually to be really open and transparent about things that you like about someone. I think one of the most
Mm.
intimate acts to do with somebody is to laugh together.
Yeah,
When you laugh, I have a very bad sense of humor. Like, I laugh at really inappropriate things, all stuff you shouldn't, right?
I'm the same.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
genuinely terrible. But, like that moment where you just lose it, and you're crying, like you cannot get it back. Like, that is
Mm.
such a let go moment. People with eating problems will really struggle to laugh. They will really struggle to let it go. They'll have some critical voice saying, you look stupid when you laugh, your face goes too red, you show too much of your teeth, like whatever it might be. There'll be this constant thing happening. So when you then think about that on a more intimate level, about actually connecting with somebody romantically or having sex with somebody and allowing the body to like really be in connection with another, like that's a whole another level of difficulty and intricacy that you're trying to navigate. And I pull that all back out and I think, right, go back to your Hinge and your swiping, and you kind of look at someone, you go, don't I you, don't I you, don't I you, don't I? Like there's nothing that says I'm connecting with this person because I have a feeling about them. It's all about, have a visual understanding, a set of criteria, and you do or you don't meet them. And I 100%, 4 or 5 years ago, found myself single after a very, very long time, went on the apps, looked at them, and I did exactly that. Nope, 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 no. And I thought, I'm just not designed for this. And I thought I was going to get murdered if I went on an app, so a date. So I didn't do it. But,
Yeah.
I think they are fascinating in terms of like what
Mm.
happens in that connection.
But also a lot of the time when you meet people, I might be oversharing here, but that a lot of the time it's like, oh, well, do you want to come around, watch TV and Netflix and chill? It's like there's no the connection. You're not building any, you're not getting to know the person. You're staring at a screen, you're probably having sex, and then you're saying, right, okay, well, now I
So
feel
yeah.
better. So
Yeah.
and it does become a form of addiction,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it becomes a form of, I'll feel better if this person comes around and I have sex, so then I can, and then what you get is, pardon the phrase, serial shaggers. You just get people that continue to have people round, feel good for a day or two, and then think, oh my God, I need someone round again to show that I'm actually good enough.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
And that continues to happen. And I think one suggestion I made, this is when I was in a relationship, but I do think it still stands, is if you really like someone and you've been dating them for a while, the one thing that you can do that will really, test the relationship to see whether it's good or not good enough is go on holiday somewhere really rogue with the person. Because if you go backpacking with that person and all of a sudden all the romances go away, you've got a toilet that's a hole in the ground and you've got food poisoning, and like the curtain's gonna open and you're gonna see the real person, and very quickly you're gonna figure out whether that's your person or not your person.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I say that to a lot of people. I'm like, instead of the superficial rubbish, if you really like someone, just take him to, Thailand and see how you figure that out. And that a lot of the time you'll say, "Oh, there's some red flags here. This isn't my person." Or you end up laughing with that person because someone's got food poisoning. You end up,
Yeah.
having so much fun with that person in these bad situations. And that is what relationships are. It's making light of a good situation. It's putting comfort in the other person when you feel bad.
Yeah.
And I feel like just today it's missing, and it's so sad. I see it in my brother's single. I see it, he's trying to find someone, but it's really hard. You can't really approach someone that you might like because you have to do it through the apps because everyone thinks you're weird. And then
Yeah.
if you do actually want to do something with that person, they just want to watch TV. And it's difficult, but
Yeah.
it's just really interesting how society's shifted to that quick dopamine hit. That's what love is, and it's not.
And I think it's perpetuated then by, you go onto your Netflix and you watch these dreadful movies where, you get these idealized views of what a romance and a relationship should look like and how people should behave and what they should say. And if you have an argument and somebody, heaven forbid, shouts at you, then, clearly they're abusive. And, we've got this kind of very difficult narrative now. And everybody has these, and, I hear people, people come into treatment, they have this incredible language to describe things. And I think, wow, where's this come from? But where's this, sometimes where's the substance in what you're saying here? What do you feel at that moment? What do you actually want to say? Sometimes we do get it wrong and we do say things that are hurtful and we do let people down. And all of that is the resilience building, as you say. Can you repair it? Can you come back together again after that? Did you laugh when someone's vomiting in a bucket and actually they're like, this just isn't funny anymore? And you go, oh, okay, actually, yeah, fair enough. And then what do you do together with that? Like that for me is where you get really strong, sustainable, meaningful relationships, and you learn to navigate and work stuff out together. And watching these ridiculous films where someone's moved back to the hometown and they haven't been there for 20 years and they meet each other and, it's just not how it goes. And they tend to do something absolutely dreadful that then everybody just sort of seems to overlook and we all just move along. And I go, oh, that's not very accountable, is it? Where, it's just not based on a sort of, it's not helpful. And I do worry about what that means for sort of future generations in terms of having not just, I don't know, sustainable relationships, but being happy and feeling content and that feeling of real satisfaction when you're in a relationship with somebody that you kind of know this is your person. Like you say, there's a level of safety and security in that relationship, but we can take the knocks, we can have a crappy day and we can still be okay. And I think that's the bit that sort of breeds safety. And in my world, then means you're not having to sort of do your kind of, reach back into your sort of early attachment wounds to sort of protect you and nurture you. You can kind of start to trust that maybe people are all right. Maybe people are safe. Maybe they can take care of me.
Yeah, I think on the subject of that, I think another concern is like pornography.
Yeah.
Like you see a load of this and people don't understand. Like, see, when you're like 14 years old, you don't know what a sex is. Like, you don't know what any of this is, and then you end up watching horrendous shit and thinking that's what it's meant to be.
Yeah.
And I really, I think that for all that ban in the UK was, there was two sides of this. One is that the government want control, and the other is that it's actually a good thing for children not to see these things. I kind of see both sides of it, but children are smart. 90% of people use a VPN. I mean, it's so easy to get around, and it really concerns me that that's so readily available. I mean, every girl that you see on Instagram now, like they're probably on OnlyFans. They're over sexualizing things, and people genuinely think that's how relationships are that's how you
Yeah.
you do it.
Yeah.
And they're growing up thinking that. And I don't know, like I grew up in the days that there was like magazines,
Yeah.
and you could hardly find any of them.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But and I'm kind of glad in a way. And I think that when people are in relationships, and what happens inevitably if you're 3 years into relationships, the sexy starts to fade slightly. It
Of
becomes more
course. Of
serious.
course.
You know, you might have a kid or you might have a dog, and the
Yeah.
dog shat itself, so you got to clean up the dog mess. And
Yeah.
and I think that the connections in your brain, if you start, you know, the intimate time you're meant to spend with your partner, if you're watching porn instead,
Mm.
your brain's going to get switched on by the screen instead of your partner. And then this rift starts to happen, and then eventually you break up. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a huge concern as well. I don't know if you've seen anything about that in your research or.
I mean, I think what we see from a body point of view is just these, again, very edited bodies who
Yeah.
they are entirely unrealistic, and often have had lots of surgery and procedures, etc. So I think that can be very, very disturbing. And again, this sort of what is beauty in porn is typically very thin, hasn't got any hair, massive bits all enhanced, so the ideals are very, very complex, I think, for people on both sides to sort of make sense of. Men as well as women have these bodies have suddenly got to look like they're sort of they're sort of built for this kind of sexual performance, essentially. And so, like you say, then this sort of sexualization then starts to sort of manifest in other areas of people's lives. And again, it's effective. So, we see sort of young, sort of, I see a lot of sort of mid-teens who perhaps for what, and all genders actually, who are starting to sort of compare their bodies to these sort of highly sexualized images, and then starting to sort of internalize, I think, some of these appearance ideals. And that's what I see becomes really problematic. Once they start to really believe it, then they start to do that sort of, again, the sort of body surveillance. They start to really start to hold their body up to these ideals for themselves. And in doing so, one of the things we talk a lot about is that people then lose connection with the body, with the felt sense of the body again. So, I'll say to people, "Oh, do you enjoy sex?" And they sort of look at me like, do I enjoy it? Like, what do you mean? Like, well, what do you like? Well, I don't know, and it's really awkward. It's all terribly embarrassing because we don't talk about that. But actually, why are you having it? Like, what's the point of it? And often it becomes, well, it's something that you have to do. It's how you get into a relationship. Back to your Netflix and chill. Like, it's the stage that happens after you've met somebody. And I'm thinking, does it? And then this pressure to have sex younger and younger, which, regularly people now, 12, 13, 14, like starting to have full sexual relationships. And this all starts to sort of inform the way that your body develops and grows in the world, and the way that you then relate to other human beings. It's quite shocking, really. And I think it's one of the areas that's, and I see it a lot, where people start to try to manage the body in this very sexualized way, or have to step away from it because it is too difficult. If you're 13, 14, 15 and your body is starting to change and all of those hormones are starting to show up and it feels overwhelming, it's terrifying. If you don't have the body that looks like you think the body should look, or perhaps you've grown up in a culture where, sex comes with, I don't know, certain fears, for example, or you've had sexualized things happening to you that have been very frightening, or you've witnessed things that you don't really understand. And I've seen a lot of young men actually who have been very traumatized by things they've seen in pornography. The fear around what's going to happen to their body, the things that they should be doing, some of the more sort of violent porn that they've witnessed, assuming that this is what they're going to have to engage in, like very, very traumatized about those experiences. Flip side, women or young girls who think that that's what they're going to have to do and endure, I remember when the 50 Shades of Grey movies came out, and
Yeah.
I mean, I was working with a young woman who was sort of late teens at that time, who, the things that they were disclosing were sort of starting to happen in sort of relationships that they were having, and the things that they were being invited into were absolutely terrifying. And, I was having to go away and look stuff up, thinking, wow,
Yeah.
like this has become like just sort of the common discussion. So I don't know. I think I think you're right. I think it's a really, really big issue, and it has all of this shame sort of woven into it, this sort of either sexual shame that you do or you don't know, or this confusion because actually I don't have a desire to be like that or do that, or I do have a desire to be like that and do that. Like, what does that make me, These fears of being judged, like you talked about. I've worked with lots of people who unfortunately have had shared photographs of bits of their bodies that have gone, into much wider groups than they would have anticipated or hoped, and teachers see it or parents see it. And, I've seen people very suicidal as a result of that. There is so much complexity in this, which, I don't know how we get hold of it, but I'm not sure, like you say, having said we have to be 18 and you have to sign in, has really helped manage it. And from what I can see.
I think the fear of judgment's a huge one. And I think that, and you're right, people don't actually know why they're doing certain things a lot of the time because they're not thinking about it. They're having sex because it's the done thing. I have a boyfriend, so I need to have sex, or, and I think a lot of that goes back to the phones, and I can see it. So nightclubs were huge when I was young, right? It was like, without saying too much, I'm not sure if you know Sub Club. Do you know Sub Club?
Yeah.
It's where everyone used to go and take drugs. And, that's where we would go because it was fun and
That's
we
what
were
you did.
16 and everyone went there. Get drunk and do whatever you're going to do. But the age of that is dying. And I think it's directly correlating with social media, because what's happening is when I would go to a club and get blutered drunk and do whatever I was going to do, I knew that realistically, I'd never talk about that again, and nobody would talk about it again because everyone else was drunk and nobody has a photo of it because, why would you take a photo? You're having fun. Whereas now, if you go to a club and let's say you're paralyzed drunk, you're paralytic drunk, your friend goes, "This is hilarious," and takes a video. And then that video goes on Instagram, and then that Instagram gets shared around. And then all of a sudden everyone's screen recording it. And then all of a sudden you go for a job 10 years later and it's, "Oh, well, you did this when you were 16. And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, that's absolutely, I deleted my old Facebook page because when you're 12 years old, the horrendous shit you write on Facebook, obviously you're going to do it because you're stupid and you're naive and you don't understand how the world works. And you don't actually understand the concepts of, all these different concepts that are flying around now. So I think that the fear element is huge and the judgment element. So people are just, they're terrified of actually knowing themselves. Because that could come with judgment, that could come with cancellation, losing a job, whatever it might be.
Say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, wear the wrong thing, go round with the wrong person, like by association, suddenly you're kind of, it's the level of, I feel so sad when I talk to people now because I think it is so complicated to navigate relationships. And I sometimes I think, am I overthinking this? I work in a world where perhaps I do see when things go wrong, which I also see when things go right because I see people recover and that's extraordinary. But, I meet people who've had really difficult experiences. But, more and more when I talk to people now, this is what people are experiencing. This is what's happening. This is what's forming, as you say, and whether you go out clubbing or you go and sit in a pub or you talk to someone in a bar or, you bump into someone in the supermarket and you have a conversation and you say, "Do you want my number?" These sort of very natural kind of connections for human beings, which have been lost. And I sort of hope there's going to be a kind of counterculture and people are going to sort of, start to try and take a little bit more risk and sort of check it out. But I also recognize that the risk of taking the risk is so high. And I don't know if it's harder. I'm not a man, obviously. I don't know if it's harder to be male in that scenario and take that risk because, as you say, someone says, "God, there's really weird creeps like asking me for my number." I don't know. Has it always been that way? Maybe. I can remember desperately fancying someone, desperately wanting to ask him out, and never quite getting the confidence up. And for years I was like, "Oh, it's the one that got away." But I guess some of that is human nature. That's the frailty, the insecurity, the uncertainty. And now we have this added layer of, well, should I, can I, what happens if, I get rejected, not just personally, but, could I end up losing my job? Because I've asked someone I work with out for a drink and they said no. And then I'm being done for sexual harassment. It's super complicated, super complicated.
I do have faith. And one of the reasons that I have faith in part is from doing this podcast, and like people tune in because
Mm,
it's unedited. It's just
mm,
mostly unedited. Maybe we have
mhm.
a toilet break, but like
Yeah,
apart from that,
yeah,
the podcast is just two people chatting, and it
yeah,
could be about anything.
yeah,
We started this conversation about eating disorders. We then went on to sex and social media, and
yeah,
it's I can see people craving just connection with someone, feeling like they're in the room having a conversation,
yeah.
and really being there. And I do feel, and I really hope that that continues. Like I really do hope. I think that people they're tired of the disconnect that comes with the social media making us more antisocial, because that's what it's doing realistically.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think people are starting to drift into that more human connection thing, and bringing it back to the kind of the weight loss, or the disorders. I think having human connections is what will help you in the long run,
Mhm.
because when you do get an eating disorder, as you said, you start distancing yourself, and it's going to be a lot easier to distance yourself if you already have very little connections. So I think that I really believe, I'm really positive about the future, because I can see it starting to happen. And I do think that people will start to, crave the human connection more than they perhaps used to. Social media is fun, but then when you're 10 years on, you think, right, Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
what, you're still posting on Facebook?
Yeah,
Right. Right.
exactly. And I think your point is really relevant. Why do people, we're seeing increasing levels of mental health, or whatever that means. We're seeing people become increasingly unwell, right, with anxiety, depression, eating problems, addiction rates, etc. Everything is increasing. And the big question for me is always why? Why are people feeling this level of distress, this level of discomfort? And, you pick up your news app, you look around the world and you think, Christ, it's not good, right? And so there are all sorts of things happening kind of globally. There's things happening locally. There's things happening within me. There's things happening, within my friendship, etc. So I think you're right. I think the difficulty we've got is that the longer this continues, the less able people are to do it. Like, you know, like we say, for me, the natural thing would be sat in a coffee shop, chat to. I mean, I talk to everybody all the time. It's very embarrassing for everyone, but like that's just how I've always been. But sat on a tube, sat on a train, sat in a coffee shop, sat in a pub, going to a club. I still go to clubs and I still have a chat with people in clubs
Quite
because
right.
quite right. Why shouldn't you? But I think these are like important things to do because that's where you kind of have human to human connections. But I've got the skills to do that because I've always done it. And my dad was like that, and I think he was terribly embarrassing. My nan was like that. She was very embarrassing, but now I'm like that and I'm probably embarrassing. But that for me is a set of skills that we're just not seeing in the world in the same way. And I think that's what worries me. So it's great that people, are open to listening to two people rambling on about things and going, well, this is really the stuff that causes distress. This is why people get eating problems or addiction, etc., because they're feeling lonely and disconnected and unseen and unheard, and they don't know how to get help, and they don't know how to reach out to someone and just say, fuck, I feel really shit at the moment and I need someone to talk to. Like we've lost that skill to sort of trust ourselves in that place and be vulnerable. And I just think that's massively sad. I think it's hugely sad.
No, I totally agree. Kerrie, where can people find you if they're, I mean, obviously there's the business side of things, but are you on Instagram? Are you on, obviously there's a website, but where can people find you?
We're on all of those channels, and I would love to be able to tell you how you find this. But Orri-UK on Instagram, we're on TikTok, we are on Facebook. I have my lovely colleague Kat who does all of that because I'm a bit hopeless. But yeah, so we're on all of those places, and we do Instagram lives and we do webinars and we talk about all the kind of things. Mostly are sort of around eating problems really, but we talk about humans actually. That's what I'd like to say. I think we talk about human beings and the sorts of things that cause us distress and discomfort in the world. So yeah, that's mostly where we are. And then we've got treatment in central London or online as well if people need support. So yeah, they can find us through our website.